Greetings and welcome to Chapter 12, the Presidency. So, the Presidency. There's so much to discuss here. One of the ideas surrounding the Presidency is this idea that if I have a problem, right, that I can just contact the President and the President has all the authority, all the power to take care of whatever this issue is that I'm facing. But do they actually have the power to be this cure-all president? Well, we're about to take a look at we're going to be taking a look at qualifications, the succession line, the impeachment process, presidential powers, the War Powers Act of 1973, and how political scientists study state behavior. So, with all that said, we got a lot of ground to cover. Let's begin. So, qualifications, right? Just like we saw with senators and with House members, right? There are qualifications that a individual must meet in order to be able to run for president. And this is detailed in the US Constitution. First is you have to be 35 years of age or older, but bare minimum 35. You have to be a natural born American citizen. You have to be a resident of the United States for 14 years. And that's it. These are the three qualifications that are listed in the U.S. Constitution. That is it. Notice that we have the lack of experience. We have the lack of education. Notice that all you have to be is 35 years of age or older, at least 35 years of age, and a U.S. citizen, right? Of course, U.S. resident for 14 years, right? So these are the three qualifications, and that is it. Which begs the question: what qualifications do you want to see in a presidential candidate? This is a similar question to what I asked in regarding the U.S. Congress, right? What kind of characteristics, what kind of personal traits would you like to see, or experiences for that matter, that you want to see in a presidential candidate? And then, kind of think about who has those qualifications, potentially that has not run before, and are they considering running for president in the upcoming presidential election, whatever that may be, right? What characteristics do you look for? It's a good question, right? It's a good question. But before I move on, that's it. These three qualifications, and that's it. That's all that's in the Constitution. Does that surprise you? Is that a little surprising? Not so much, or what's your thoughts? Let me know. Anyways, so the term of office, right? Remember, we've talked about how the delegates of the Electoral College are elected. Now, that is true for Texas, right? That in Texas, that we elect our Electoral College delegates at the state party conventions. I just need to throw that out there real fast. But yeah, so remember that the president, they are selected, they are chosen by the Electoral College. We vote for a slate of delegates, if you will, and then those delegates cast a direct vote for the president. Presidents, they serve a 4-year term, meaning that meaning that they serve 4 years in office before they're up for re-election, right? And then if they win re-election, they get to serve another term. So total of 8 years, assuming that a president does in fact win the re-election. Now, we should note that a president can only serve a total of 8 years. Whether it's consecutive or not, they are term limited by 2 terms. That is a total of 8 years of service as president. And this is because of the 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment, which was ratified in 1951, solidified what George Washington started when he was the first president. If there was one moment in history, in American history, that I wish I could go back and witness with my own eyes, it's this moment. The moment that George Washington said, I've served 2 terms, I've served 8 years, I'm done. I'm passing the baton. I'm passing on power. I'm releasing political power and giving it to someone else. We had a smooth transition of power. This is monumental, not only in the context of U.S. history, but in the context of the world history. I mean, think about it. We had a human being that the colonists or early Americans wanted to crown this man king, right? And he said, enough. I've served 8 years. I'm done. The next person, here you go, right? This incredible moment in U.S. history, world history. So I would have loved to have been there. But that's George Washington's attitude towards that, right? He established a tradition. Presidents have served only two terms of 8 years total throughout U.S. history until we get to FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt. That changed. He served, what was it? I don't have the number. Either 3.5 terms or 4. And that was because of the Great Depression and, of course, World War II. So that changed. That went beyond the tradition for special circumstances. I think we can all agree. Well, Congress decided to amend the Constitution and make sure that future presidents would only serve a total of 8 years. That presidents cannot go beyond it. It is unconstitutional for any president to serve longer than 8 years total. Whether it's consecutive or broken up, it doesn't matter. They get to serve a total of 8 years. 2 terms, that's it. So, presidential term was moved from March 4th to January 20th by the 20th Amendment, which was ratified in 1933. So we see a smooth transition of power between a president and the incoming new president in January. But January 6th is typically when you see the U.S. Congress meeting, the U.S. Senate meeting, and certifying the Electoral College count, which we have a formal declaration of who is the president, who is the next president for the next 4 years. And then by January 20th, that new president, whether it's the incumbent or whether it's the challenger, they are sworn in, and they are running the government, or the executive government, from January 20th on to the next election. Right? So 2 highly important amendments that we need to know. Let's move on to presidential succession. So the 25th Amendment, which was ratified in 1967, it defines presidential disability policy and the vice presidential vacancy. So if a president becomes disabled for various reasons, right? Mentally disabled, potentially even, if a president has to go under the knife, right? If he has to get surgery, or if she has to get surgery, they can surrender power temporarily to the vice president because the vice president is in direct line of succession. Or it depends upon the severity of that disability, not going beyond surgery. If it's something like they develop a mental illness that prevents them from being an effective president, right? The 25th Amendment could be used, right? We've heard quite a bit in recent years about the 25th Amendment and what it can do, but it sets out that policy, right? And basically, in short, it's the cabinet. It's the presidential cabinet that gets to execute this 25th Amendment to effectively remove the president. Now, again, this was ratified in 1967, so relatively new to the Constitution, but this was in fact required. The first time that it was exercised, not the removal part, but the vice presidential vacancy component of the 25th Amendment. And this was first exercised in 1973 when President Nixon nominated then Congressman Gerald Ford to be his VP in the wake of filling the vacancy that Nixon's original VP left when he resigned. So, interesting. And when we talk about the presidential line or order of succession, right? The Presidential Succession Act of 1947 sets up for us who is in direct line. So obviously it's the president, right? The president is the head of the executive branch according to the U.S. Constitution. And if the president is, God forbid, if something were to awfully happen to him where they are no longer among us, then it's the vice president. If the vice president is, God forbid something would happen and they are not with us anymore, then it's the Speaker of the House that becomes acting president. Well, if something happens to them as well, it's the Senate President pro tempore. If all four so far are not among us anymore for whatever reason, then it goes to the cabinet member, starting with the oldest, which is the Secretary of State, and ending with the youngest, which is the Secretary of Homeland Security. So there's a ranking here, right? Which is one of the reasons why you may recall any time that we have a State of the Union address, when any president makes a State of the Union address, this is when all members of this is when the president, the vice president, the Speaker of the House, the Senate President pro tempore, other various cabinet members, they are all there present for the State of the Union address, which is the reason why there is always one cabinet member. It's done randomly, but there's always one cabinet member that is deemed as the survivor, meaning they are in a secure location, away from Congress, away from this joint session to hear the State of the Union address. They are in a safe location that, in case something were to happen, like an attack, that there is one surviving cabinet member that would become the acting president, God forbid, if something were to happen. So, the Presidential Succession Act of 1947 clearly lays out this order of succession. It's interesting stuff. Now, let's talk about impeachment. Lots to talk about here, right? Article 2, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution states, and I quote, "The President, the Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors," unquote. Again, that's Article 2, which establishes the executive branch, exactly. Section 4, okay? So it clearly lays out this process. Well, I say clearly. We have to go back and take a look at previous in Article 1 as well, which establishes the legislative branch. But it clearly lays out that a president can be removed, or a vice president can be removed for conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, we got to talk about the role that Congress plays. Now, remember, we kind of already talked about this in a previous video, but let's dive a little bit deeper into this, right? So, congressional roles. The Constitution is a little vague about this process. The impeachment process is legal. It's a legal process in the context of the U.S. Constitution clearly establishes impeachment. Now, it's a little vague in certain areas, but the U.S. Constitution does provide us this mechanism of impeachment. That is clear, that is legal. Now, is it a legal process in the context of like law and order? Conviction of a crime and serving jail time. No, it is not that. If you are thinking like Law and Order, ding ding, if you're thinking of Law and Order, this courtroom setting uh, that the defendant, being the president, gets to defend themselves and have these legal arguments, and then a jury finds them guilty or not, that is not the impeachment process. So it is legal in the context of it's clearly it's the process is established in the Constitution, but it's not legal in the context of the president is found innocent or guilty, and you have to meet this high burden of proof that is beyond reasonable doubt. It's not that. Okay, so let's get into this. Okay, so it's a little vague, but so it's up to Congress, right? I said the conviction of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. What are high crimes and misdemeanors? Well, Congress gets to define what those are. and I'm not playing, I'm not joking. Congress gets to define what is a high crime and a misdemeanor. Right? They get to define that. Historically speaking, things like lying under oath, which is perjury, which is a crime, they have said that's impeachable. We're going to take a look at a case of that in just a moment. Right? But Congress gets to define what other high crimes and misdemeanors. Notice that it's not treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors. No, it's one of these. It's either treason, it can be bribery, or this high crime and misdemeanor. Again, whatever Congress wants to define that as. It's vague, but it should be, right? If it was extremely detailed and very explicit about what is impeachable, you could have a potential president that could cross those, that could go up to those lines, but not crossing legally, if that makes any sense. And that's dangerous. No one wants that. No one wants that from any political party, right? So it's vague in the context of what is a high crime and misdemeanor. What is that? It's vague, but the process is clearly in the Constitution that allows the U.S. Congress to act as a check on the president. Remember, we have a system of checks and balances. So, yeah. So anyways, the House. So the U.S. House of Representatives, they would levy impeachment charges against federal officers, such as Supreme Court justices and the president and or the vice president. Okay? So they get to levy these charges saying, hey, we think they've done either treason, bribery, or this high crime and misdemeanor. They've done something, so we're levying this charge against them. And again, this is a part of the oversight and investigative powers and responsibilities that Congress possesses that the Constitution grants them, right? And then the Senate, right, they conduct this trial. Now, again, this is not a law and order trial where you have a judge declaring judgment, innocent or guilty as charged, right? That's not what this is. The burden of proof is extremely low here. You do not have this, beyond a shadow of a doubt that this individual committed this crime, right? Not like you and I think of when we think of a court setting. An impeachment is not law and order. This is not that type of trial. But the U.S. Senate does conduct this trial. So what does this look like? Well, what this looks like is, think of the U.S. senators acting as jury members, the defendant being the president and the presidential council, whoever they elect to represent them. Then the U.S. House members, certain few are chosen to lay out this legal case against the president. And then the senators get to vote whether or not the argument is credible, whether or not this constitutes a high crime or misdemeanor, right? or impeachment or treason or bribery, whatever the charge may be, does this cross this threshold of Article 2, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution? Well, and then um, the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, they serve as the judge, if you will, of the impeachment of the proceedings within the U.S. Senate. They do serve in that capacity as they oversee this process of impeachment. And then, of course, it's the function of the U.S. Senate. If the U.S. Senate believes that it crosses this threshold that's established in Article 2, Section 4, and the U.S. House of Representatives have made their case well, and they believe this is a act of that this warrants the act of impeachment. It warrants being removed from office. Then it's up to the U.S. Senate to remove them if they believe it's crossed this threshold. Otherwise, they get to pronounce. So they get to remove or acquit the U.S. president. Right. So if they believe the argument, they will remove the president with this vote. If they don't buy into the arguments for whatever reason, political or not, partisan or not, put that to the side, they get to decide not to move forward with impeachment, just to acquit them. Okay, so yeah, that's the role of Congress. The U.S. House of Representatives investigates, levies these charges against the president. The U.S. Senate acts as the trial, if you will, where we have the defendant, that is the president. Then we have the U.S. House members making their case against the president. Then it's up to the U.S. senators to choose whether or not to buy into the argument, does this cross that threshold or not, and just simply acquit the president of all impeachment charges. And then, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice serves in the capacity as overseeing the process. And that's that's the congressional side. So, some examples that we can look at in U.S. history regarding impeachment. Okay, so we first go back to President Andrew Johnson, who was accused of violating the Tenure of Office Act by removing Secretary of War. Back then, we had a Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, a supporter of the radical Republicans. Okay, the president was impeached by the House of Representatives on February 24th, 1868. But the U.S. Senate did not find him guilty of these charges and acquitted him, meaning while the president was in fact impeached by the House of Representatives, and he did go through this process in the U.S. Senate, the U.S. senators just acquitted him. And this happened on May 16th, 1868. Fast forward to 1970s, and we get the impeachment of President Richard Nixon. Right? He was accused of abusing power in the cover-up of his campaign's involvement in the Watergate scandal. So just really real quick, his campaign staff members wiretapped and listened to Democrat strategists, okay, at Watergate. And this, of course, created this scandal, and the president used his power to basically cover it up, right? Which was an abuse of power. And the House Judiciary Committee recommended articles of impeachment on July 27th, 1974. And before the U.S. Senate could have that trial, President Nixon resigned on August 9th, 1964. Instead of dragging the U.S. in this messy process of impeachment, he decided to step down. Now, whether you like Nixon, whether you don't like Nixon, whether we don't remember Nixon, put that to his side, right? The fact that he resigned, that he was, I guess if you were to use this language, he was shamed enough to just resign. Is that what do you think about that? Was it the fact that he was shamed into resigning, right? That his fellow Republicans in the Senate told him basically in no uncertain terms, yeah, there are enough votes here to remove you. Even Republicans are going to be voting against you, right? Do you think that he resigned out of some sense of duty or some sense of shame, or do you think that it was just a pragmatic thing to do? That if he resigned, right, that he would just dodge this bullet of impeachment? What do you think? Another case of impeachment, we fast forward to 1998. So President William or Bill Clinton, he faced impeachment on the grounds of perjury, right, and obstruction of justice. So again, remember that the U.S. Congress gets to define, the U.S. House gets to define high crimes and misdemeanors. What does that mean, right? Now, obviously, it's not a traffic ticket, right? I mean, it's not driving too fast or or not coming to a complete stop. It's not that. That doesn't warrant being removed, right? But high crimes and misdemeanors, perjury fits that bill, pun not intended, right? Obstruction of justice, that is a misdemeanor, right? So the U.S. House of Representatives levied charges of impeachment against President Clinton. Basically, in short, the scandal that was involved here, President Clinton lied under oath regarding a relationship with Monica Lewinsky, a White House intern at the time. He lied about it under oath. The fact that he had an affair and the fact that he had this sexual relationship with this intern, that was not the reason why he was impeached. He was impeached for perjury, for lying about it, if that makes sense, right? So he faced impeachment. The U.S. House of Representatives did levy these charges against him on December 19th, 1998. But he was acquitted of the charges by the U.S. Senate. So what we've seen so far is when articles of impeachment are levied against the president, so far, right, we've only seen 3 presidents that have been impeached, and each time the Senate acquits them, with the exception of course, Richard Nixon. We don't know, other than some news stories and some sources that said that there were enough votes in the Senate to actually remove him, but the president, Nixon, decided to resign, right? I'm recapping from the previous slide, but you get my point here. Right? So what we've seen is the Senate supports the president, acquits them of these charges, okay? We have another example of impeachment, and that is the impeachment of President Donald Trump. So let's dive into this. Of course, with this particular impeachment, there is so much we can learn from. There is so much sources that we can go to understand the charges that were levied against them by the House. Right? So in 2019, President Trump was impeached. The U.S. House of Representatives levied charges against him of soliciting foreign interference into the 2020 presidential elections, and of course obstruction of justice for interfering with congressional oversight, for interfering with the investigation into this. The House did levy these charges against him, and the president was acquitted by the Republican Senate. Fast forward to 2020, just a year later, President Trump was impeached yet again for the incitement of insurrection for his role in the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. What we should note here is President Trump goes down in U.S. history as the only president to be impeached twice. Now, regardless of what we think of President Trump, whether we support him, whether we're on the fence about him, or whether we do not support him, right? Regardless of where we stand, the fact is he was impeached twice. The House impeached him. The House levied charges of impeachment, and he faced impeachment twice. No other president has faced that. And you probably have noticed, right? Throughout this discussion, we've only had, let's see, Johnson, Nixon, Clinton, and Trump, right? They're the only presidents in U.S. history. We only have 4 presidents to face impeachment. Now, what's interesting about this is you probably caught on that it has increased more frequently, right? That we went from 1970s to the late 1990s, and now 2019, 2020, that we see impeachment being used more frequently. Now, that is a fair and legitimate observation. But what's interesting to note is that impeachment, it's not used. The House of Representatives, just because they are the opposite party of the president, does not choose to impeach simply because they don't like you or simply because they don't like the president. Right? That's not the case. We have had so many examples of divided government. The idea that the House and the Senate, or the U.S. Congress and the president, are controlled by the opposing parties. Right? Put all that to aside. The impeachment is not a lighthearted thing. It should never be used as a way of saying, I don't like you. Right? And it should never be used that way by any political party. Any. Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever the case may be. Impeachment should only be used, only, when the president has crossed the line, when they have committed a high crime and misdemeanor. Right? And I would say that, inciting a riot or inciting an insurrection, lying under oath, or abusing your power to stay in power, these acts violate the constitutional oath that these government officials make when they are sworn into their positions. Right? This isn't about Democrat, Republican. This isn't about Trump or Democrats. No. This is a matter of rule of law. Right? No one is above the law, not even the president. So when a Democrat president commits perjury, lying under oath, should be impeached. At least face those charges and let the Senate decide. If you incite a riot to hold on to power, forget Democrat, Republican, you should face impeachment for obstructing the smooth transition of power. And then, of course, right, abusing your power to stay in power. Again, all of this, to sum up real fast, if a president steps out of line and crosses over into these high crimes and misdemeanors, okay, then we have the mechanism established by the Constitution, established by the framers of the Constitution. They granted us this process, or at least it granted the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, and indirectly you and I, they have given us this process of removing a president if they've crossed that threshold. So, what do you think? And do you think that this is being used too frequently now? Or do you think this is being used appropriately? And what do you think about potential future presidents when political parties talk about, even before a candidate wins or loses, that we're going to impeach the president? What do you think about that? Is that dangerous rhetoric? Is that just partisan politics? Is that part of the course, if you will? Or is there something to that? should we be more careful? Should we expect our representatives to be a little more careful with the wording? Let me know. These are good questions, though, right? Yeah. So presidential powers. So executive authority, executive powers. What can the president, in fact, do? Right? We've taken a look at what they can do, right? Treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. Right? So we know what they can't do to a degree. What can they do? Let's take a look at this. Right? They can nominate heads of departments, agencies, bureaus, etc. Right? They have nomination powers. They get to nominate. Unlike the Texas governor, right? The only position that the Texas governor can appoint without a position being vacant is the Secretary of State. At the federal level, the president gets to appoint all these positions. Right? That's a little comparison I like to make with the Texas governor. And the reason for that is to demonstrate the differences and then demonstrate that the president does have all executive authority as the U.S. Constitution grants that to them. Right? That doesn't mean they have all power and they are this all-powerful being. No. But the U.S. Constitution does grant the president all executive power. Notice that all legislative power is to the legislature, not to the executive, right? So the president is not this all-encompassing powerful individual, but they are a powerful individual within the context of the executive branch because they are the head of the executive branch. That's what I'm trying to get at. I'm digressing. They get to issue what's known as executive orders. We're going to be taking a look in just a second at these executive orders, okay? So bear with me. We're going to be looking at executive privilege, this idea that, if you're the president, that there are certain communications, there are certain discussions that are just between the president and his council or the president and his cabinet for various reasons. But we're gonna look at that and just note that if there is an interest, especially in the context of was a crime committed, that executive privilege can only go so far. Yeah, I'm digressing. And of course, executive agreements. We're gonna be looking at exactly what those are and how they are used. So let's dive into executive orders first. So important features of executive orders that we need to know about. Right? First, it's an official document that is numbered, through which the U.S. president manages the operations of the federal government. Okay, so they are numbered consecutively. And an executive order is an order by the president, and it instructs how the government is to work within the framework established by the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Congress. So, need to take a quick sidetrack here, just for one quick second. Have you ever watched Pirates of the Caribbean? Like the first or the second one, I can't remember which one. And they talk about how the pirate code is nothing more than guidelines. That's kind of what we're talking about here with executive orders. We should note, an executive order does not, repeat, does not create new law. It does not appropriate additional, or it does not appropriate any money whatsoever. It does not have the power or the authority to, because the president does not have that authority or power. Only the legislature, let me say that again, only the legislature can create new laws, and only the legislature can appropriate funding or move funding from one project to another project. Okay? Only the legislature can do that. The president executive orders here are nothing more than guidelines for how so the executive orders, right, they work like this. within the framework of the U.S. Constitution, within the framework of what has been passed by law by Congress, whatever the laws are that Congress has passed, the president can issue these executive orders to have influence on how policy is implemented, not how policy is created necessarily, right? Because they don't have that authority, but to influence how it's implemented. This is what the law says, and I cannot go outside of it. This is what the Constitution says. I cannot operate outside of that. But with this law, whatever this law may be, the president can issue these executive orders that can influence how implementation of that law is done. We're going to take a look at some examples, but just note that the U.S. Congress, the executive orders that any president signs bypasses. It does not require congressional approval. But again, note, it does not create law. It does not appropriate funding. It can't. The president, the executive branch, completely lacks that ability due to separation of powers, due to the Constitution, due to the fact that those are, the president's not given that authority. Okay, that's what I'm trying to get at. So some examples. May 25th, 1861, President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. This is a civil right that's protected by the U.S. Constitution. July 26, 1948, President Truman desegregated the armed forces with this executive order. He issued this executive order, and it desegregated our armed forces, because prior to this executive order, they were segregated, right? And then November 20th, 2014, President Obama exempt the children of illegal immigrants and parents of legal children from deportation. This is also referred to as DACA. So you might be thinking, well, hold on, Professor Patterson, you mentioned something to the effect of presidents cannot create law, and yet we get DACA. Correct. Remember that the immigration laws that have been passed by Congress, how are they implemented? When the president, as the head of the executive branch, which is responsible for the implementation of policy, implementation of laws passed by Congress, they get to set guidelines for how those laws are in fact implemented and carried out. And President Obama, through an executive order, created this exemption that the law allowed him to do, if that makes sense, right? The law was written in such a way that it allowed the president to create this exemption with executive order. Does that make sense? If not, let me know. Let's move on, because we got more ground to cover. So, the downside to executive orders. First, you're risking the court. You are risking the courts coming in and striking down any executive order. Any. They can deem that action, that executive order, as being unconstitutional. Because remember, the judiciary branch, they have that power. They have that authority to interpret an act or a law as being unconstitutional. And so you are risking the courts from striking that down. Okay? Future presidents can always undo previous executive orders. Look no further than the travel ban, for example. Right? President Trump signed this traveling ban with an executive order, and then President Biden undid it with an executive order. So future presidents can always undo previous executive orders that a previous president had written. Also, the appearance that a president cannot pass their agenda through Congress, and they can only they're only resorting to executive orders, this is problematic for various reasons. Main thing is that you're not effective, that the president can't work with Congress to get that agenda passed. So so they are resorting to bypassing Congress through these executive orders. This appearance can be very negative and can have serious consequences for the president, particularly with any potential upcoming election. Right? And of course, acting as an all-powerful executive leaves a very bad taste to us, the public. Acting as an all-powerful executive in a system that is literally designed to limit absolute power. The fact that we have three separate branches of government, the fact that they are separate yet co-equal branches, and that they do serve as a check and balance against them all. Right, the president has a check and balance with the judiciary, with Congress, Congress with the president and the judiciary with the president and Congress. Point I'm trying to get at is that our system of government is literally designed to limit absolute power, to limit the power that Congress and the president and the judiciary has. So if you are acting as this all-powerful president and by issuing all these executive orders, you risk looking like you're power hungry, right? Now, signing executive orders is not in of itself evil or somehow undoing the will of the people. Let me be very clear about that. Right? That is not the case. It is not. But this is a risk if you are relying on executive action, if you're relying on executive orders. Right? It's a gamble. It's a risk. I digress. Let's move on to executive privilege. So, some key concepts regarding executive privilege. That this concept does not, let me say that again, does not exist in the U.S. Constitution. It doesn't. It's an implied power mandated by separation of powers, right? So, again, the U.S. Congress is its own branch, the legislature is its own branch, the executive branch is its own branch, the judiciary is its own branch, right? So the president has this implied power of executive privilege because they are a branch of government, right? If this makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know. Right? Let me know. But this practice goes way back. This is not new. This is not a new concept. This goes way back to our first president, George Washington. Okay, the controversy centers on the conflict between a president's right to open advice, right? Because we're going to be talking about this quite a bit when we look at foreign policy in chapter 17. Bear with me for just a second. I'm going to digress just for a second. But in foreign policy, choices always exist. Always. Let me say it again. Always exist. Now, it's possible that some choices are better than others, right? For example, what should we do with North Korea? Well, the discussion can range from doing absolutely nothing and just keeping the status quo to trying to engage with them in high-level talks or even low-level talks to de-escalate whatever situation's happening, or the extreme, nuke them, wipe them off the face of the map. All these are choices. Some are better than others, right? I hope we can agree with that, right? But the point I'm trying to get here is choices always exist. Some extreme, some are do nothing, and some are more reasonable or more desirable, right? Well, the president, right, should hear all these choices. They should. And the president has the right to open advice, to open counsel, to have those discussions and not feel, right, that, oh, well, this discussion about this extreme act that we could do, right, that somehow that this is going to be held against them and somehow lead to, whatever, embarrassment, hurt them in polls, or whatever the case may be, right? And of course, on the other side of Congress's right, not only to information, but to solve that function as oversight. It's a balancing act, okay? It's a balancing act, and that controversy centers on that balance, right? Anyways, let's move on to executive agreement. What is it? So an executive agreement is an international agreement between the president and another country made by the executive branch and without the formal consent by the U.S. Senate. So we got a lot to talk about here. So note that the U.S. Constitution makes it clear that when the U.S. signs a treaty, that the president must receive the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate in order for that treaty to be ratified, in order for that treaty to be good, in order for that treaty to be signed. Again, congressional oversight is always a good thing. Oversight is always a good thing. But when we're talking about a time when we can fly to foreign nations, right? That we can be in another country within hours, and that situations are more, they are rapidly changing, right? At an increasingly rate, by the way, right? And the information can come and go very quickly today compared to previous times in U.S. history, right? That the president needs some flexibility. The president needs to be able to sign, agreements with foreign nations and not have to go through the formal process, because that takes time. And if you're looking at a situation that either could lead to war or that could lead to a stronger military alliance, whatever the case may be, right, you need the president that has the flexibility to be able to carry out the duties, carrying out the responsibility of being the head of the executive branch and conduct foreign policy effectively. And these executive agreements allows them to do just that. They basically carry the same weight as a treaty with a foreign nation, but it bypasses, it's done without the formal consent by the U.S. Senate. So let's take a little bit closer look at this, right? So some key components of an executive agreement. First, it's ratified without Senate approval. Okay, so these executive agreements, they are made with foreign nations that it completely bypasses the U.S. Senate. The U.S. enters into far more executive agreements than formal treaties each year. One of these reasons is Congress is just allowing this to happen for various reasons, but for the most part, deniability, right? This idea that, well, we didn't do that. We didn't sign that into law. Oh, we didn't make that treaty. We didn't. The president did. Right? And if you're the opposition party, that being able to deny that, right, you can just blame the other side. Whether that's fair or not, that's what happens. Obtaining Senate approval is extremely cumbersome, as the Senate is able formally to consent only a few dozen treaties each year. They are busy after all. And therefore, executive agreements provide the president more flexibility in an ever so changing political arena on the international stage. So these are some key components here, right? So some examples of executive agreements, right? the North American Free Trade Agreement of 1992, the original General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, 1947. These executive agreements were instrumental in the implementation of the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, and is also used to modify individual tariff rates as part of the periodic round of trade agreements with other nations. So it gives flexibility. It provides the president flexibility to be able to maneuver in this ever so changing international environment. So other presidential powers. They have legislative powers. Indeed, they do. But note that it's limited, right? Because legislative authority is given to the Congress. Exactly. Right? So legislative powers. They do get to sign laws into law. They get to sign bills into law, or they get to veto that legislation, meaning they can either sign it and say, you know what, I agree with this law, this bill, this piece of legislation is good. It is exactly what I think is good for the nation. I'm going to sign this piece of legislation into law. Or they can go, Congress, what were you thinking? What is this mess? No, I'm not gonna sign this into law. This is madness. Veto. I'm gonna veto it, meaning I reject this. Right? Note that if the president does in fact do that, the U.S. Congress can in fact overturn that veto with a 2/3 majority vote from both chambers of Congress. He does give this the State of the Union address. This is an important part of the presidency for various reasons. Mainly, it gives the president a platform to tell Congress, hey, this is my agenda. Now, let me be clear. It's up to Congress. It's up to Congress to decide that is a good agenda. We are going to pursue that, Mr. President. Or, Mr. President, I don't know what you've been eating. I don't know what you've been doing. But no, we completely reject this. Right? Point here, Congress gets to decide. They get to, in fact, reject this agenda, because they have that authority, or they can accept it. It's up to Congress. But the president can, in fact, call a special session of Congress together for various reasons. Maybe there's not an accident, but maybe there's an event that happened that requires legislative action. Right? He can call them to the special session if they're not in session to conduct this business. Right? So the president has these legislative powers, as we call them. But no, he cannot or she cannot create law. They cannot appropriate funding. They cannot move funding from one project to another. They can't do that. That's not the type of legislative powers they have. They can veto. They can sign a piece of legislation into law. They can give their agenda, what they believe is best for the nation. And before I forget, State of the Union address is also the president's platform to tell you and I what they want more accurately, coherently, articulate. Being articulate with that. It gives them the opportunity, and that's important for you and I. Right? We need to know what the president. Obviously they ran for election, and if assuming they won, right, the president, that obviously we know what they're thinking, but to be in the office, to have now knowledge, special reports from advisors, etc., having that, and then being able to articulate and to let you and I, the public, know what they're thinking. Extremely important. So, other presidential powers include judiciary powers. Yes, indeed. Judiciary powers, in fact. Note that judicial powers, that the president does, in fact, nominate federal judges. Yes, federal judges is indeed in a judiciary power, because this is a mechanism. Being able to appoint federal judges is a mechanism of checks and balance that the president has on the judiciary. But the president can also issue a pardon. This is a president's action to absolve someone of blame for a crime and secure his or her release from prison. Now, I want to make this quick statement about pardons. No one seeks a pardon if you're innocent. You know what I mean with that? I mean, no one seeks one. No one wants to get one unless there is some conscience of guilt. Right? I mean, if you're completely innocent, I don't understand why someone would seek a pardon. Does that make sense? I'm just throwing that out there. But this idea that the president can just issue this pardon that absolves him of blame for a crime. Now, what should be noted here, that pardons only work for federal crimes, not state crimes. Just throwing that out there. Other presidential powers include military powers, right? And diplomatic powers. We've already seen a little bit of that with these executive agreements, right? But the president gets to grant diplomatic recognition to other nations. They receive and appoint ambassadors, right? So they receive ambassadors from other nations and they appoint ambassadors to other nations. They negotiate treaty and executive agreements. We've already taken a look at that, right? But the international agreement between the president and another nation that bypasses the formal consent of the U.S. Senate. And of course, they are the commander-in-chief. That is, the president, gets to determine when and where to send the U.S. military. So, they are the commander-in-chief. The U.S. Constitution makes this clear. They are, in fact, the commander-in-chief. Okay? And they are the commander-in-chief. So, the president gets to decide when and how to use the military, right? But Congress is responsible for, do you remember? Yes, exactly. They are responsible for maintaining and supporting an army and a navy. And through the Elastic Clause, the Air Force, and the Marine Corps, right? So Congress has a role in this process as well. Now, for the most part, Congress has been hands-off with the exception of declaration of war. Remember, that's another power that only the legislature has. Only Congress can declare war with another nation. Okay? Only Congress gets to do that. Not the president. But the president gets to control the troops. He gets to send them into action. Right? So there is a little bit of a back and forth with Congress to a degree. And look no further than the War Powers Act of 1973 to see that relationship. Let's dive into this. So the War Powers Resolution, or it's also referred to as the War Powers Act of 1973. Recall from the previous lecture that we talked about a resolution is basically the opinion of Congress versus an act or a law passed by Congress is a statute, is law of the land. Right? The War Powers Resolutions refer to both as this War Powers Act and the War Powers Resolution. We're referring to the same thing, right? But it's more accurate to refer to it as the resolution. I'm digressing. But this was the War Powers Resolution of 1973 was the attempt by Congress to limit presidential power to commit armed forces abroad without congressional approval by passing this resolution. So remember, this was a reaction, right, to the Vietnam War, this War Powers Resolution, right? When it was passed, Congress, the U.S. President Nixon at the time, said this is a trampling of my constitutional authority as commander-in-chief. You are placing limitations. No, I'm vetoing this. Right? Well, Congress then superseded that veto with a 2/3 majority vote in the House and the Senate, and this becomes the opinion of Congress. And some would argue that the War Powers Resolution does in fact hinder the president. Others would say, no, it doesn't. So let's take a look at what the War Powers Resolution did. Okay. The important components that we need to know. The president can only send armed forces into a war or into areas where imminent hostilities are likely for 60 days without either a declaration of war by Congress or a specific congressional mandate to continue on with military operations. The president can extend the time armed forces are in combat area for an additional 30 days to withdraw without congressional approval for a total of 90 days. So the resolution says that the president has 90 days of military operations before he or she must receive approval or a declaration of war. Right? So that's what the resolution does. Now, what we need to note here, right? Consequences. There are none. The resolution state no specific congressional action if the president refuses to comply with the resolution. Now, this is interesting, right? And while some may argue that this is a weakness of the resolution, and it well may be, at the same time, that's a limitation, right? I mean, Congress needs to have the flexibility, because it needs the flexibility to be able to assert its authority and power granted to it by the Constitution, that if your hands are tied, you may not be able to communicate or effectively assert that authority into a situation that any particular president has gotten themselves into. So the resolution lacks any consequence. It does not lay out any specific consequence. However, it's always presumed, that Congress would exercise its purse strings to suspend funding. Y'all, it costs money to shoot a missile. It costs money to pay our troops. It costs money to deploy armed forces into a combat area. So Congress, with the ability to appropriate funding, right, to fund a war, to fund a military operation, it's always presumed that if Congress wants to assert itself, it'll cut its funding. Mr. President, you're not getting that funding. You're not. It's always presumed. And that is a powerful tool for which Congress possesses, the power of the purse. But yeah. So the War Powers Resolution was an attempt by Congress to assert themselves, receiving the pressure of the backlash of the Vietnam War, to assert themselves in the foreign policy decision-making process. Right? And it's interesting. It's really interesting. Now, do presidents comply with the War Powers Resolution of 1973? How effective is the War Powers Resolution of 1973? Let's take a look. So, Clinton administration, the Bosnian War from 1992 through 1995, Clinton made reports that were consistent with the War Powers Resolution about the use of U.S. forces, but never cited Section 4A1, and thus did not trigger the 60-day time limit. Yes, there's a loophole. The Bush administration, the Iraqi war from 2003 through 2011. Congress gave the president a specific mandate to use military forces against organizations and persons in the wake of 9/11 terrorist attacks. What I want to take just a quick brief second to mention this. Congress gave the President Bush, George W. Bush, Congress gave the president a mandate to hunt specific people. This was a first in U.S. history. Now, I'm not making a political statement here. This is just rather a statement of fact that Congress gave a mandate to hunt organizations like Al Qaeda and hunt people, Osama bin Laden, and that mandate was given by Congress. Right, and of course the Obama administration, the Syrian Civil War, 2011 through present day. So we're going to take a moment here to dive into the Syrian Civil War, okay? Because I think it's important for us to see a recent example, and we're going to wrap up this conversation with the discussion of how effective is the resolution. So these are the blue text for what you see. This and these dates that you see. I will provide the links to these YouTube videos, but for right now, all I'm going to do is summarize them and briefly discuss what they are. These are all news reports from BBC, AP, CNN, etc. So we're going to look at this time frame real quick. Now, again, I'm going to provide these links to you, and I would highly encourage you to watch these. Don't just take my word for it. Okay? Click on these, watch them in progression, and because it's important. So, on August 20th, 2012, President Obama established this red line. He said, in short, that if he saw chemical weapons being used, that this would change my calculus, and that this would be something serious. Okay, he said that it would be a red line, that using chemical weapons, the movement of chemical weapons, the usage of chemical weapons will be a red line. Now, you and I both know what a red line means, right? If someone draws a line in the sand, right, we know that if we step beyond that line, there are consequences. That's what a red line is, right? It is it's basically an ultimatum that if you cross this line, there will be consequences, right? August 20th, 2012, President Obama made this statement at a press briefing that he establishes this red line. August 21st, 2013, 1 year, 1 day later, we saw the usage of chemical weapons. That, in fact, President Assad of Syria used chemical weapons and killed approximately between 1,300 to 1,600 men, women, and children. These were civilians that were killed with a gas, with a weapon of mass destruction. So this crossed a red line, this red line that President Obama established 1 day in a year before. Okay. So on August 26, 2013, literally 5 days after the attack, we get the Secretary of State then, John Kerry. Kind of lost that name for a second. John Kerry, he came out and said that Syria must be held accountable. That there is nothing more deserving of scrutiny, right? And that basically there's going to be consequences for this, because this shocks the conscience of humanity. Right? Well, fast forward to September 1st, 2013, President Obama goes before Congress, or he at this press briefing at the White House, he discussed how he is seeking congressional approval for a military strike. Now, President Obama was extremely clear about a couple of things. One, no boots on the ground. Two, this is going to be an airstrike. Three, very, very limited in duration and scope. Okay? So, what that means is, one day, this is an airstrike, single event airstrike, no boots on the ground, no military involvement beyond this one strike, right? So let me ask, did the president need to ask for permission for an airstrike? No. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 granted him the authorization to use military force up to 90 days. This one military strike, which would have been conducted and done within an hour, if that, does not require the authorization from Congress, because he is the commander-in-chief. Okay. And then by asking Congress for approval, there were critics that were saying that, well, you're backtracking from the red line. You have said that this will cross a red line, this would change your calculus, and now why all of a sudden are you asking for Congress's approval? And then the president basically said at a conference something to the effect of, well, I didn't set the red line. The world did. The UN did with its treaties against WMDs. And that's a backtrack, right? Or maybe it's not. You guys let me know. Maybe I'm making too much out of this, but you let me know. Right? And then all of a sudden, on September 10th, 2013, President Putin of Russia comes up and says, hey, I have a plan. I have this idea that we want to go in and remove and make sure that that President Assad of Syria doesn't have any more WMDs, does not have these chemical and gas weapons. Okay. So all of a sudden, with President Putin doing that, he comes off as, this world leader, if you will. He with the absence of consequences of this red line, right? We allowed this situation I should say, a third party, if you will, another actor within this sphere of this world, allows this other leader to come up and say, hey, I got an idea, right? So we went with it. The United States went along with this. And did it work? Was Putin successful? Now, again, note this is 3 years after the President Putin came forward and said, hey, I have this idea. So did it work? No. We saw yet another chemical attack against men, women, and children, not military forces, not some armed militia group. No, men, women, and children. We saw yet another chemical attack, August 3rd, 2016. And then President Trump's response, right? So remember that President Obama established that clear red line on August 12th. Note, through 2013, we had this, there should be consequences, and then, of course, backtracking. Now we get into a new administration. Right? President Trump was elected as the duly elected president in 2016. And now we have this new chemical attack 1 year into his presidency. And what happened? Well, President Trump decided to conduct that airstrike. We struck President Assad's ability to use chemical weapons. We did. And in this video from CNN on April 4th, 2017, you see a Syrian civilian discuss this. And he is thanking the president over and over and over, thanking him for the consequences, for holding President Assad of Syria, accountable for this act, right? So, but he goes on and says, you know what? Let's do more. We need to do more. Keep putting the pressure on President Assad for violating human rights, for waging war and using these weapons of mass destruction, for using conventional weapons on men, women, and children. Right? And then, as we held him, we saw yet. So we launched chemical tech, then we had this response, and then lastly, President Trump decides to pull out of Syria. That we are no longer going to have a presence in Syria. So, as he was thanked, we decided the president pulled us out. Now, whether or not you think that was wise, whether you think that was, we should be doing it, we shouldn't be involved in all conflicts. What this did was it created a vacuum within Syria. And the vacuum was filled by President Putin. So, while we shouldn't be the police of the world, at the same time, I don't know if I can trust autocrats, if I can trust authoritarian leaders to do what's right. And we're gonna be diving into this discussion, okay? We're gonna be diving into the discussion of whether or not we should get involved as much as we do when we get to foreign policy. So bear with me. So how effective is the War Powers Act of 1973? There are loopholes that the presidents have exploited. There was no real consequences, right? And the U.S. Congress, while it's presumed, cutting funding to the military, that's like political suicide. So how effective is it? You let me know. Maybe I'm just cynical and maybe I'm just critical of it. Let me know. So, went the wrong direction. So, we're going to finish up this lecture with a discussion of levels of analysis, okay? We struggle, political science, we use these three levels of analysis to understand behavior of nations, okay? And therefore, we use these levels of analysis to understand foreign policy and how it's conducted, okay? So, we have the first is the individual level, the second is the state level, the third is the system level. We're just going to go through this quickly, okay? On the individual level, we are literally looking at the impact of people as individuals, right? So the focus is on the people, the leaders. Leaders make policy. It's not just random that the White House, that this building creates foreign policy. No. It's the leaders. It's the national security advisor. It's other advisors to the president. It's the president speaking with the VP. They are making decisions. People are making decisions, right? So the focus is on people as individuals. So we look at and we analyze, right, values, belief systems, psychological traits for which they may have, their nature, their educational background, their life experiences, the things that make them, right? For example, and so an example of individual level of analysis, we can literally explain World War II by simply examining Adolf Hitler, his rhetoric, his beliefs, his nature, his psychological traits, right? We can apply this to the Syrian red line. Why did President Obama punted to Congress to seek approval, even though he already had the authority to do what he asked, that he originally set out to do? We can look at the individual level. We can take a look at, there is a anecdotal story about how the president was struggling with these consequences and with what to do. And an advisor advised the president to ask Congress for authorization. That way, there's no political blowback from the Republicans specifically, because Congress would approve it. And how can anyone, especially the Republicans or any other political party that voted for it, how can they then point the finger and say we shouldn't have done that, right? So that having that conversation and bouncing ideas off of other people, right? Some of us, we operate that way. I know I do. I do not necessarily have to have other people tell me what to do, but it's good to have someone to listen to me, bounce ideas off of, and to actually walk it through out here in the open rather than try and debate it in my head. And you might be likewise. My wife and I, we are very, very different, right? She likes to internally make those decisions. For me, I need to have them spoken. I need to have that, balancing ideas off of the wall to actually process what's going on. So looking at President Obama's psychological traits to understand, right? That's what I'm trying to get at. State level of analysis, right? We are looking at how the organization and operation of a government affect policy. The focus is on the state, its behavior and characteristics of a state. For example, is it an autocracy, a democracy, a republic? Does it have a strong executive branch? Does it have a strong judiciary branch? Are there fair and free elections? How is policy conducted by the state, right? So we look at the forms of government, the political culture, and yes, even the geographical location of a particular country. Because if a country like the United States, if we have friends and allies to our north and south and two large bodies of water to the east and west, well, that has an impact on our foreign policy, right? So democracies behave a certain way. There is a theory that if every government was a democracy, there would be no war. It's a theory, right? So if every state, if every nation was a democracy, right, then we could explain our behavior easier by looking at our forms of government. Not just easier, but we can explain these things by looking at the political institutions. Okay. And finally, wrapping this up, closing this out, we have the system level of analysis, where we look at the external pressures that impact a nation's policy. Remember, okay, that the international system is this sphere for which we interact with one another. It's the world, right? We interact with one another through this international system. So what are nations doing around us? What are they doing? That has an impact on our behavior. If they're gearing up for war, are they coming after us? Then we need to build up our military, if that makes sense, right? That's not so much the case for the United States because we have allies to the north and south of us. But you get what I'm trying to say here, right? So the focus is on this system for which we interact with one another, right? The cause and effect of the cause of the international system affecting the state, right? We look at the power characteristics of the international system. We're going to dive way deeper into this in foreign policy, but just note that there are three types of power structures. We have a unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar. Right? A unipolar is where there is one actor in the international system that dominates the system. Right? Then we have a bipolar, where there are two actors fighting for dominance, fighting for the title of hegemon of the international system. And then, of course, we have the unipolar, where there are a host of actors having influence in the system. Okay? We're going to dive deep into that. But just note for this, that we can understand the behavior of states in our foreign policy. We can understand the behavior of nations, that is, during the Cold War. Why did we overthrow a democratically elected president in Guatemala in the 1950s. Why did we back a coup to do that? Well, it's during the height of the Cold War, and we did not want a government that close to us friendly with communism and with Russia, or then Soviet Union. So these are the three levels of analysis that political scientists that we use to understand why nations behave the way that they do, why foreign policy is the way that it is. That being said, we're going to bring this now to a close. And if y'all have any questions, comments, concerns about anything, please shoot me an email and let me know. But until next time, be safe, and we'll see you. Peace.